Hello, my name is Alan Chen, and today I'll be speaking about my final presentation for CIS 3367. As you probably know by now from my midterm presentation on Airbnb, I'm very interested in traveling. As a student on a tight budget, I have to pick where and how I choose to travel carefully. With $1,000, I could travel to Portland for 17 days, as you can see here, or I could travel to Chicago for 13 days. Let me just show you that really quickly. Let's see. Chicago. Just press the search button here. And give me all the costs for Chicago. And then I would use Solver. And there you go. 13 days. Now you're probably wondering, okay, how did I do this? How did I come across these numbers? And well, I applied VBA to extract my data and Solver, as you just saw, to analyze how many days I could spend in a certain city. Now, before I dive into Solver and how it worked with the data, let's take a look at where I pulled the data from. And I pulled data from a website called BudgetYourTrip. And BudgetYourTrip, you can essentially search up any city in the world and find various costs, average costs that were submitted by just actual travelers from around the world who decided to visit the city and decided to provide information regarding how much everything cost. And then BudgetYourTrip would actually compile the data and average it based on certain categories. And these categories were very helpful when I was trying to decide how many days I could spend in each city. Now, BudgetYourTrip's information isn't free. Technically, I could go here and extract the data, but it would be borderline illegal. So they did have an API, which is very helpful. And what an API is, or in this case a web API, is an application programming interface. And that essentially allows me as a developer to ask BudgetYourTrip to send me data when I made a request. Say if I wanted to know data about Chicago, right? I can send an API request and ask them, can I get data about Chicago? About how much it costs to stay there for one day? And they could give me that data. And they could take out all this extra stuff that is really needed, because I'm not really interested in this description about Chicago right here. Or, stuff like that. I'm interested about these numbers, and their API would just send me back just their numbers, and that's very helpful. Most of the time, APIs are free, especially by large corporations like Google, Facebook, and so on. But in this case, it wasn't. The BudgetYourTrip team was kind enough when I asked to provide a free API key for my project, for my school project. And thank you for that. Now, with this API key, an API key essentially is a unique identifier to who I am as a developer. I've listed the API key here in this sheet. I can't show it to you because it's unique to me. If you need an API key, I would encourage you to contact BudgetYourTrip, and they might be able to provide one. Now, with this API key, I built a search button that essentially searches their database for information regarding the city I put in here, and then it would feed data into the sheet called raw data. And these numbers is the category ID, which you saw, which actually relates to a category here, which I was able to find by asking the database for more information. Now, just going back to the raw data, I didn't get this data in a format such as a comma separated value, a CSV file. Instead, I got this as a JSON in the JSON format, which is another data format similar to CSV. But just to give you an idea of what JSON looks like, this is what JSON looks like. It's not the most friendly looking data, but if you really parse it by the JSON format, it comes out to something like this. It's pretty neat, it's pretty straightforward, and it works very similar to a dictionary. But still, VBA doesn't come built in with a parser for JSON, so I can't really read this data here, except as a very large string, which isn't very useful for me. So I used a third-party tool called VBA-JSON, which essentially is a library that allowed me to feed in a string, a very long string, formatted in JSON, so that they can basically convert it. to a dictionary that I can use and basically copy data over to my raw data sheet. And then from this, I was able to move the data to a formatted data sheet so I can know which category related to, so I can match each category ID to a category. And then from there, I was able to pull information regarding just each type of expense. If I was to live if I was trying to travel on a budget, if I was trying to travel on a mid-range level, or if I was trying to travel in luxury. But from there, this gave me a load of information. And then I know I'm oversimplifying my code a little bit too much. The VBA code is here along with documentation. You are free to go through it and just see what I used, how I used it, and the tools. But the VBA code is commented. It's commented on Visual Basic as well. You can see every line is commented, just right above the line that the piece of code that I wrote. Now, it's very straightforward about what I did. Basically, I made a function that mapped to my search button that you can find here. And then I essentially just I pulled the city name, and then with the city name, I asked the API, could you tell me exactly how much it would cost to travel to Chicago for one day. And if you read through this code, you'll see that, I listed the API key here, and then I sent the request, an HTTP request. And from there, I got back some data, and I checked if there was an actual city by checking if the size of the data. And if it was greater than 0, then there was a city. And from there, I proceeded to extract the data. And I could go through all of this, but it might be a little bit too boring. So instead of that, let's try out the tool that I built, the main tool. Now, like I said, you could put any city you wanted. And here, I also limited the constraint to just the 3 that I listed, or the 3 that were available on Budget Your Trip, which was budget, mid-range, and luxury. And say if I change this to luxury, obviously, 13 days I can't travel, on that type of a budget. So I had to change it. So I had to use Solver again. So instead of saying my savings aren't $1,000, let's say I had $3,000 to travel to Chicago for a certain amount of days. I don't really know how much days I could travel on a $3,000 budget. So I would simply use Solver. And now let's look at Solver a little bit more closely here. The objective I set was D16, which is essentially the total cost of everything. And I set it to the max value. But the constraints I set on it were that this number had to be less than my savings number, or equal to it. I can't have it more than it because it would exceed my savings. And I had to make sure all these digits can't be less than 0. And I had to make sure that my days was a whole number or an integer, because you can't travel for half a day. The prices get a little bit fuzzy there. And I don't think Budget Your Trip was built for half a day travels. It was meant for more of a one day thing. So with those limitations in hand, I simply press solve, and then I would get back a value. And I could travel for 4 days. Not a lot compared to 17 and 13 before for the other city. But still, I know how much I can travel on a $3,000 budget if I want to live a luxurious lifestyle there. Now, just to speak a little bit about these datas, all these datas are a per day basis. So that means one day I would spend $356.83 on accommodation or hotel stay, and then $107 on transportation, and so on. Now, there was other data included in the API, but I decided to exclude it just because some of those don't relate too much to me. For example, on alcohol, I don't drink that much alcohol, so it's not a big cost for me. Souvenirs, I travel for myself, not to buy and purchase a lot of souvenirs. So you can include those costs, but for me, I just focused on what I wanted. But they essentially work the same way, or in a similar way. Now, 2 of the limitations are that it only works with United States cities, and not all cities are in the database. Besides that, I find it to be a very useful tool for planning my future travels, and I intend to keep using it. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed listening to my project.